morning. My name is Gene Whitney. I'm the manager of the energy section of the Congressional Research Service, and I'll be moderating the session today. I'd like to thank, first of all, Congressman Doc Hastings for hosting this briefing, and acknowledge the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee for the use of their room. Also, the Geological Society of America is providing the goodies on the table, and help yourself. You might want to keep your blood sugar up during the briefing. As most of you know, the U.S. relies heavily on fossil fuels. In fact, 83% of energy consumption in the U.S. comes from fossil fuels. 62% comes from oil and natural gas. And the U.S. Geological Survey is widely acknowledged as a key, authoritative, impartial source of data, geologic, scientific, and assessment data for all of these fossil fuels and geothermal as well, both for the nation and for the world. Today's briefing will focus on unconventional oil and gas resources. USGS has been doing these kinds of resources for many decades, and as the U.S. energy mix evolves, they're building on their tradition of excellence in assessment to include assessments of unconventional gas in coal, unconventional oil and gas in shale, and natural gas from hydrates. They also continue to address the effects of the development of these resources on land use, ecosystems, and human health. Today we have three speakers who are going to describe some of the work that USGS is doing and how the information that the USGS produces is used by a wide variety of audiences, including policy decision makers, land and resource managers, federal and state agencies, the energy industry, foreign governments, non-governmental groups, academia, other scientists, and of course the public. We have three short presentations. They're going to be about 10 minutes each, and if you could hold your questions until all the presentations are completed, we'd appreciate that. Our first speaker is Brenda Pierce. Brenda is a program coordinator for the Energy Resources Program at the USGS. Brenda manages and oversees the Energy Resources Program, including research and assessments on all geological energy resources and the environmental and human health effects of energy occurrence and use. Prior to joining the Energy Resources Program, Brenda was chief of the USGS National Coal Resource Assessment, the first digital assessment of the coal resources of the United States. Brenda?
Thank you, Gene, and thank you all for showing up on this hot and humid but beautiful Friday. So I'd like to talk to you today about oil and gas resources and what the USGS does in that realm. Before we get to that, as Gene said, we look at all geologically based energy resources. So we do oil and gas, but we also look at geologic carbon sequestration, we look at gas hydrates, we look at coal, coal bed methane, oil shale, heavy oil, uranium, etc., as well as the environmental and human health effects of energy occurrence and use. But today we're going to focus on oil and gas, particularly unconventional oil and gas. So I know many people in the room know this, but I want to take a moment before we get into it, for those that don't, to talk about some of the parameters that are needed to actually form oil and gas and to preserve it, because it's a pretty unique set of circumstances that even give us oil and gas in the first place. And so this is important because you will understand what we look at, what we do research on, and what we assess. So you have to have organic material even to begin with. You have to have organic material that's thick enough, rich enough, quality enough in the ground and to be preserved, and then it needs to be buried because it needs to be heated to a very specific range of temperature. Not enough heat, it doesn't form oil and gas. Too much heat, but oil and gas is not preserved. So already very unique conditions to form oil and gas. So you need the organic material, it to be heated to a very specific set of or range of temperatures, and depending on the temperature is whether oil or gas forms. Because oil and gas is buoyant, It will want to migrate up through the system if it can. So it migrates up toward the surface, often or not often. Sometimes it does actually migrate to the surface and it's lost. But often it hits an impermeable layer. And this impermeable layer then traps it. And this is what causes, or this is what leads to conventional oil and gas resources. It migrates up through the system, gets trapped here, and this is what we call a conventional, either oil or gas. The difference between that and unconventional resources is that in unconventional, the organic material has been transformed to oil and gas, the same type of oil and gas, but it stays in what we call the kitchen, where it gets cooked. It has not migrated up through the system. It is pretty much here or very close. And that's because the rocks or the reservoir in which the organic material formed and then the oil and gas formed is so tight, so impermeable that it is not migrated. And so that's the basic difference. There are others, but that's the basic difference between conventional, that's migrated up and been trapped, and unconventional, and by unconventional I mean coal bed methane, shale gas, tight gas sands. Also oil, tight oil like the Bakken. So that in a nutshell. So we need to look at all of those parameters. It's important to understand, did that form in the first place? Has it been preserved? To even know if oil and gas is there. And that's why our assessments are very geologically based. So to put it in a nutshell, again, they're geologically based. It's important to have that robust geologic model. They're statistically sound, and I'll explain what that means in a moment. They are hypotheses concerning the quantities of oil and gas that have the potential to be added to proved reserves, both in the U.S. and the world. It's important to point out that what we do is produce estimates of undiscovered but technically recoverable resources. So these are not resources that are already being produced or are economic to produce. These are resources that have the potential to be added to the energy mix, both domestically and around the world. USGS provides a comprehensive and consistent treatment of these. We have a methodology that we do all conventional resources on, and a methodology that we do all unconventional resources on. And that means they're comparable. You can compare a basin in Alaska to a basin in Saudi Arabia, and those results, while different, will be comparable. We're transparent. We get every assessment methodology that we develop externally vetted, and we publish it, so you know what we did. We also publish our assumptions, our geologic assumptions. So if you disagree with us, you can add your own assumptions and redo it. Not everybody always agrees, but we are transparent. As I mentioned, we spend a lot of time on developing the geologic model of each basin and each assessment unit that we assess, so that it is tailored to each basin. And this is what I mean by statistically sound. It's what we call probabilistic. So instead of getting one number as a result of our assessments, we give a range of numbers. Because these are undiscovered, it's inherently uncertain until you drill and you know there is uncertainty in these. So we give a range of estimates. We give a 5% probability, a 95% probability, and a mean. Usually in the press, usually in discussions, you'll hear the mean, the middle range, given as the number. But all of our assessments are given in that range. Sometimes they're narrow, because we have a lot of data and a lot of information, and sometimes they're very broad. So it's important to keep in mind that there is inherent uncertainty in these assessments. So why is this important? As Gene said, we're very dependent upon oil and gas, but if you look at all projections, I don't care who does them, all projections for energy use for all sectors are only going up. So it's important to understand how much we have, where it is, what kind it is, how easily accessible it is, etc. Of that, the liquids is the oil and the natural gas. Of that, a large and growing percentage is unconventionals in the U.S. And so this is the growth pattern of the percent of total U.S. natural gas production in the United States. And I think this is not a surprise to anybody. It's growing and is projected to continue to grow. So this is all unconventional gas. Of the unconventional gas, I think it's important to realize that there are multiple types. Shale gas gets all the press, gets all the questions, gets all the attention, but if you look at this, the majority is still tight gas sands. So this is still an unconventional resource, but they're in sands versus shale. Shale is a rock made of mud, and sandstones are a rock made of sand. Coal bed methane is still a very viable domestic production in the United States and makes up part of the energy mix. And shale gas certainly is growing, but look at that compared to tight gas. And I don't mean any other point other than there is more than shale gas and unconventionals, and so we need to keep this in mind as we look at these things. So to take you through what that actually means, so remember the conventional versus the unconventional. This is a conventional reservoir, and that means where the oil and gas is housed in the rock. This is a hand sample, so you look at it either in the outcrop or in your hand. This is what it looks like under the microscope, a photomicrograph. So this is microscopic. These blues are the pore space, and that's where the oil and gas actually is housed. There's not a big pool of oil and gas underground. They're actually housed in these pores in these rocks. And that's what you have to get at to produce the oil and gas. And so you need interconnected pore space, which is called permeability, to get it permeable to move that oil and gas to the wellbore and get it up to the ground. So this is a conventional reservoir. Remember, that had been formed at depth, migrated to a reservoir and housed there. But then look at this in a continuous reservoir, or unconventional. We call it continuous because of the geology. But it's very different. It's much finer grained. This is the hand sample, and then this is the microscopic sample. You can barely see the pores in there. It's much smaller. Again, you have to have interconnected pore space to get the oil and gas out of the ground. So this is why you usually have to do something to unconventionals. You have to frack it, you have to pressurize it, you have to do something to get that oil and gas moving. So they're very different animals. And that's because they formed differently, and therefore you have to develop them differently, and you have to look at them production-wise differently. So this is a comparison of the two. This is an unconventional tight gas. You can see these, they're about the same scale. So 0.5 millimeter, 0.2 millimeter, very small pore spaces. That's where the oil and gas is going to be. This is a sand. In the interest of full disclosure, this is not a hydrocarbon-bearing sand, but it's very similar to many. Interconnected pore space, huge difference. This is already interconnected, and you may not have to do much to produce this sand's oil and gas, but you would have to do a lot to produce that. So in a nutshell, again, that's a lot of the difference between the two reservoirs and what one has to do and what we look at and what makes technically recoverable. These are all not the same, and these are all not the same. So they're each very different and has to be looked at individually. This is the Woodford Shale, and this is even an order of magnitude smaller. These are micrometers. So these are teeny, tiny pores, and yet they have oil and gas in them. So these are the fast up-and-coming types of reservoirs that people are starting to produce. So technology and our understanding of how to do this has changed so much, but commensurate with that is our understanding of how to assess them and what is technically recoverable. So what do we do? So I'm jumping to a global example, and this is a view of the world from the Arctic. So there's the North Pole, and here's Greenland. So we're going to look here, right here, on the northeast section of Greenland. What we do when we go into an area is look at the geology, and so here's a whole basin, but we look at the subsections of the basin. We call them assessment units. So the rocks within this assessment are similar internally, but they're different than this assessment unit. So this is what we assess. We roll up to a basin, but we give results on each of these assessment units. As I mentioned, we need to look at all of the geology in an area. We will take any type of subsurface data that we can get. We look at seismic if we can get it. We build burial history curves of each and every assessment unit. And what we do that for is to look at how hot those rocks got over the course of its history. This is very critical to do because if it didn't get hot enough, we don't have oil and gas. If it got too hot, we don't have oil and gas. So this is one of the key critical natures. So this is partly why we don't produce assessments in a week. We compile all this geologic information from wherever we can get it to build these robust geologic models. So we compile the data, we evaluate all the alternative hypotheses, and we'll talk to anybody that can poke holes in it so we can get a more robust model. As I mentioned, we look at the burial and fluid history of the area, and then we assess risk. This is not risk of development. This is geologic risk of do we have enough information to actually know or have confidence in our results. So we look at the charge, we look at the the organic material, and was it there, and was it sufficient to actually form oil and gas? We look at the rocks. Was the trap there so that it formed the oil and gas, or was it unconventional, and is it still there? And then the timing of all this. It has to heat up after the organic material is buried. In conventionals, the trap has to be there after or before it migrates. So all of these things are very important. If you talk to other groups like industry, they may risk other things, but everybody does this when they do oil and gas assessments, so that you can quantify some of the geologic models that we've developed. And so what we do then is develop numbers, of course. You'll hear USGS estimates X, or X trillion cubic feet or X billion barrels of oil. And so we give that kind of information. But we also have a lot of geologic information to back that up. And we publish that so that it's useful for many different purposes. And so this is but one of our products. So this is the USGS domestic gas resource estimates. And we show them differently for conventional versus unconventional. And you can see that for gas, at least, they're very different distributions. You have lots of small, and remember, this is undiscovered. So this is not what's being produced or what's not reserves booked on the SEC by companies. These are what has the potential to be added to reserves or added to the energy mix in the future. So for conventional, you see lots of relatively small, discrete fields, lots of them in Alaska, obviously. But the unconventional are much larger fields scattered more differently. And these kinds of scenarios, I think, are important to know where they are, what might be the ability to get at it. We do the same type of thing for a global. Here's oil, again for conventional versus unconventional. Bakken is the unconventional, obviously, but there are some others. And I think as we learn more about how to do this with oil, these may actually, well, they will change. Whether they grow or not is another matter. As I mentioned, we also do this for global resources. This is a conventional look at, we thought this might be interesting to try. The red dots are our global conventional resource estimates on top of a NASA Earth at Night photo. And so it just kind of demonstrates that where the big uses are not always where the resources occur. So this is important politically, geographically, to understand some of these scenarios. So this is just another example of what we're doing. And we're embarking on a global unconventional resource assessment. This really hasn't been done in the detail that we would do it. And people are coming out of the woodwork to partner with us because people really do want this consistent and comprehensive look. It's such a game changer in the United States. Is it a potential game changer in other countries of the world? Just one last spot before I turn it over to our distinguished guests. Resource assessments do change over time, and that's important to know. Technology changes over time, and so what is technically recoverable changes over time. We get new geologic information and data, so our geologic models change over time. And sometimes our geologic thought process changes over time. So these things are important. Bakken is obviously one of the most famous examples of this change over time. In 1995, we assessed it and estimated that there were 150 million barrels of oil that was technically recoverable at the mean. We reassessed it in 2008 and found that there was 3.65 billion barrels of technically recoverable. It's not necessarily that we got it wrong, because by 2006 there was only 100 million that had been produced. It's because the technology had changed so significantly in that time frame, and we had a lot more geologic information from the data and drilling, that it really changed what was technically recoverable, and so what could be added to the resource base of the country. So with that, I thank you, and we'll be happy to answer questions after elder speakers.
Thank you, Brenda. Our next speaker is David Curtis, who currently serves as the director of the Geoscience and Energy Office in Washington for the American Association of Petroleum Geologists. Prior to joining AAPG, Mr. Curtis was with the University of Utah's Energy and Geosciences Institute in Salt Lake City, where he served in a variety of capacities, most recently as Manager of International Strategy Development and Senior Advisor to the Director. David?
Thank you, Gene. Well, it's a privilege to be here this morning, and I say it, as a geologist, it does my heart good anytime I'm in a congressional hearing room and you see a petroleum systems diagram or a burial history model, because that's actually my background, my technical background. But it's great to be here today to talk about the USGS Energy Resources Program, particularly in the context of unconventional resources. And there's really three things that I want you to take away from my remarks this morning. One is the scientific excellence that is demonstrated by the USGS scientists. The second is the differences between resources and reserves numbers. And this is particularly critical for those of you who are in the policy field trying to look at these numbers and understand and use them appropriately. And then the last thing is why the Energy Resources Program matters, why it is that what the USGS does is so important, and that will really then set the stage for the last speaker to talk about sort of the implications. Before I do that, just a quick word about AAPG. AAPG is not a trade association, so we do not represent industry interests. We are actually a scientific and professional association, the largest geological association in the world. We've got 35,000 members in about 116 countries, and our members actually span the gamut of industry. They work in government. We actually have several AAPG members that are congressional staff, quite a few in the agencies as well as academia. So the faculty that are training the next generation of geoscientists that are going to be involved in energy exploration. We've got three divisions. The Division of Professional Affairs certifies petroleum geologists and geophysicists as well as coal geologists. And they also certify and enforce the ethics code that every AAPG member, when they join, agrees to abide by. We have a Division of Environmental Geosciences that publishes a peer-reviewed journal and is looking at the intersection of energy and environment. And then lastly, the Energy Minerals Division, which focuses on issues like energy minerals, uranium, coal. We also do some other geological, unconventional resources like shale oil, geothermal energy, and others. Our purpose is really to advance the science globally. How do we improve and disseminate scientific knowledge about Earth systems as they relate particularly to petroleum, to natural gas, to other subsurface fluids? We do that by publishing peer-reviewed research. There's a picture of the AAPG Bulletin, which we publish on a monthly basis and is focused globally, as well as holding meetings around the world to get scientists together to talk about these issues. About 5 years ago, AAPG opened its office here in Washington, and the rationale was, as a science association, like many other science associations, GSA, the Geological Society of America, is one. Our basic tenet is that if we can get good science into the policymaking process, it's going to improve the resulting policy. So that's sort of an underlying tenet of what we and many other science societies do here in Washington, D.C. And I think that really is very similar to what the USGS does through its energy resource assessments. Some of the things that we're trying to answer are how much petroleum is out there, and where is it? Can we get it out of the ground, Barb? Brenda mentioned the fact that they focus on technically recoverable. So what is the state of the technology in order to be able to get these resources out of the ground? A recovery factor of 30%, that is getting 30% of the resource out of the ground, is a good recovery factor. So there's a lot of petroleum that's left behind. And these are obviously important to policymakers, and I served as a congressional science fellow. That's how I got into the policy arena, and so I've actually sat in these seats and tried to help my boss at the time understand how to use these numbers. But it's also important for those folks that are actually looking for energy resources, and this is a process, an exploration process. So this is the tutorial. Okay, so this is the difference between resources, which is what the USGS does in its assessments, and reserves, which are what companies report, public companies report, at least here in the United States, according to rules published by the Securities and Exchange Commission. It's important to know that the only barrel of oil or the only cubic foot of natural gas that is produced comes out of this quadrant of proved reserves. We do not drill resources. We do not, or resource assessment numbers. We do not produce from resource assessment numbers. Brenda mentioned that they're focused on the undiscovered resource potential. And so we've got undiscovered resources that they're estimating here at USGS, and those are also done at Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, as well as the Bureau of Land Management. And then we have the discovered resources, some of which are economic. These are the green ones here. Some which are not economic because the price doesn't allow for their production at this time. And so the only way that we move from these resources to something that you can produce is through the exploration process. And exploration is the only way that you get to a barrel of oil that you can produce, send to a refinery, make into products that consumers then can use. So how are they used? As Gene mentioned, I spent about 10 years, a little over 10 years at the University of Utah, working for a research institute that did about half and half oil and gas research, mostly international, and geothermal energy research, both here in the United States and overseas. And we had a variety of research sponsors from industry, from government, and I was actually requested on several occasions to do a global opportunities assessment. How do you, where should we go look for additional resources? And you might ask yourself, well, why would anybody come to an academic research institute to do that? And the answer is very simple, because the exploration process is a creative process. Brenda alluded to this. It's about coming up with ideas, new ideas that haven't been tried before, and actually going out and putting resources behind them to actually test those scientific hypotheses. So, for example, shale gas, which is in the news, it's on everybody's radar screen today, is not a new thing. We've actually known for decades that there's natural gas in those shales. But it wasn't until George Mitchell in Texas, a small independent in Texas, actually took that knowledge and said, well, how could we get that gas out? And it actually took quite a few years before the technology caught up in terms of hydraulic fracturing, in terms of horizontal drilling, to actually make that realization that we could get these resources out. That was a new idea, and that is what drives exploration. It's also why, as Brenda mentioned, we have to revise these resource assessments. We do not know how much oil and gas there is in the world. This is a process that we're discovering, and we're doing it in real time. When you look at these resource assessments and this global opportunity assessment that I did, it obviously starts with the geology. Do we have a proven or potential system where we know that there were hydrocarbons generated in the basin and that have actually been trapped? But the other issues that are important, and these, as you'll notice, are very much policy relevant, have to do with the economic viability of the resource. Can we get an appropriate return on our investment? Are the contract terms that we can live with? In terms of the operating environment, producing coal bed methane in the Powder River Basin of Wyoming and oil from the deepwater Gulf of Mexico are two very different propositions. So what is the infrastructure available? What are the technology requirements that are necessary to actually get these resources out of the ground? And then lastly, what are the political conditions? Energy is something that is planned in multiple decades. Energy time, John Hofmeister had a great line in his book, Why We Hate the Oil Companies, and it was the distinction between political time and energy time. Energy time is measured in decades, and so projects that come online are going to be active for many, many years. And so, obviously the folks that are doing this want some sort of assurance that the contract they signed today is still going to be valid into the future. But it all starts with the geology. If you don't have the resource there, then none of this other stuff matters. And that's really where the USGS and their program shine. I want to conclude by just talking a little bit about the partnership between AAPG and the USGS. One of the things that these are two of the publications that have actually just recently been published. These are two of our memoirs. The one here on the left was written exclusively by USGS or former USGS personnel. It's looking at global resources across using their petroleum systems assessments, and was published a few years ago. And then the second one is, this is something that is just come out in the last year or so, on methane hydrates, which the USGS is heavily involved in, is a potential unconventional resource for the future. The senior editor of this memoir is one of USGS's experts on this. So what does this do? Obviously, the partnership, our goal is to advance the science and to disseminate that globally. And by partnering with the USGS, we're able to do that worldwide and to our membership. And as Gene mentioned, the fact that we currently rely on oil and natural gas for 83% of our nation's energy, and because of energy time, which is measured in decades, that is going to continue for the future. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and questions when the time's right.
Thank you, David. Our final speaker is David Goldwyn, President of Goldwyn Global Strategies, LLC, an international energy advisory consultancy. He is currently of counsel to Sutherland, Asbill & Brennan, a law firm advising clients worldwide in energy and other areas of practice. Mr. Goldwyn served as the U.S. State Department's Special Envoy and Coordinator for International Energy Affairs from 2009 through 2011, reporting directly to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. At State, he conceived and developed the Global Shale Gas Initiative and the Energy Governance and Capacity Initiative. David?
Thank you. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here in the Congress under Chairman Hastings' hostship and to be on a panel with such distinguished colleagues. I'm the non-scientist on the panel, so you're not going to hear a whole lot about petroleum systems from me. But I do want to talk a little bit about energy security, and this is wearing my former State Department hat. You know, I think as all of you know, energy security for every country, including our own, is the ability to access the resource that a nation needs to maintain national power. For countries around the world, energy is really not about price. It's whether the lights come on in winter, whether the heat comes on, whether you have enough resources to provide electricity. That's what it's really about. And so energy security for the United States, for our national security interests, is very important. We care whether other countries are dependent on one source for their fuel, like Eastern Europe is dependent on Russia. We care about what kind of fuel countries use. If they are highly dependent on coal, they're not going to be able to contribute to greenhouse gas emission reduction. We also care about where they get their resources because, for example, China and India that rely on Iran, we want those countries not to rely on imports from countries of concern. We have to address the national security question that they face, which is where do they get their energy, where's their energy going to come from, and are they going to get it at a price they need. So in the State Department, we sort of looked at what do we do to advance that agenda, not for them, but really for us. And so we came up with two initiatives. One was a Global Shale Gas Initiative, which helped countries around the world which might have the potential for unconventional gas understand what it would take to get investment. And the second was an Energy Governance and Capacity Initiative, which is really about the oil and gas producers of the next decade. But having the State Department go in and talk to people and say, you really want to invest or you want to look at it, only gets you past the first conversation. So what we did is we put together a program with people who knew what they were talking about. We had the Treasury Department talk to finance ministries and central banks. And we had the U.S. Geological Survey and BOMER talk to them about how you manage the business. And the real key, the real first step, as you've seen, before resources become reserves, is to understand what do we have. And that's where the U.S. Geological Survey and Brenda and her team and the folks in Denver were absolutely indispensable partners to us in everything we did. Because the ability to have scientists talk to scientists, to have peer-to-peer relationships that survive, to be able to use federal employees and not contractors to talk to people, lowered the temperature dramatically in the room, and put a scientific face on U.S. diplomacy. We could not have launched it without them, and they were absolutely indispensable to our national security and diplomatic efforts. I'm going to talk a little bit about shale gas this morning. This is a picture of a global shale gas resource potential. And everyone sees the miracle that's happening here, and they want that for themselves. Everybody wants to have a shale gas revolution, cheap, affordable, plentiful, long-term supplies of gas. And so people are trying to figure out, do we have it? This is a picture of global shale gas resource potential, which was from a study you all may have read about, commissioned by the Energy Information Administration, by ARI, which was a contractor. And they did a desktop study which looked at where you might have resource potential. But what And this got a lot of people excited, but the reality is there has been very little drilling done. And the way you find out whether you've really got resource potential is to do the kind of things with a little supplement to the USGS budget that the State Department asked USGS to do. So we went to China, Brenda went to China, and we talked to the Chinese, but they shared their core samples with us. They shared their data, and you were able to have a real concrete sense of what does this basin look like, teach them how to do it. And that will be the pathway to investing. We do the same thing with India, we're doing it with Jordan. And that ability to get the data, to run it through the model that Brendan talked about, and then put that up on the web, that's what investors are going to watch. That's something they can say, all right, I'm going to put my money to follow that, because I know what USGS stands for, I know what the science is, that's worth the gamble. And so what we really need, and it was invaluable to have the resources that we did, there really weren't enough people in USGS to put on planes to all the countries that we would like to put them on. But if you look at the geopolitical implications of this, if China is able to provide gas for itself, if India can provide gas for itself, if Eastern Europe proves out to be able to provide gas for itself, you will change the geopolitics of the country, you will reduce their political vulnerability, you will change their economic pathway. Even in the Southern Cone or Latin America, the ability of countries like Chile and Argentina and Paraguay to be able to have indigenous gas resources is going to be huge for their economies. The ability potentially of countries in Latin America and the Caribbean to be able to import oil or gas from that hemisphere, and maybe not only from Venezuela, huge geopolitical implications for us. So this really has a huge impact. But what we need to be able to do, and what USGS is able to do, is be able to talk scientist to scientist to the people who are there to get access to real data, and then to give them a sense about whether they really have potential. And I think as a State Department person, energy outreach was a really critical tool for national security. And if you think of countries where we care about stability, Pakistan, having USGS be able to go to Pakistan and say, you might have unconventional gas potential, this is where it is, this is what it takes. You have 3 basins, that's the one that you want to look at. I mean, what we care about is the stability of the government in Pakistan. Can it provide electricity to its people? Is it going to survive? It's a huge geopolitical initiative. But energy is the pathway. Economic security, that's having enough gas to take countries, China and India in particular, large-scale sources of supply. Environmental security for countries that are using coal or in some cases wood. If you look at the Middle East, Jordan, Morocco, these are countries that are not resource rich. Their ability to have indigenous gas is going to reduce their vulnerability in an enormous way. And a lot of people, not us, but a lot of people will burn oil for electricity. If you produce indigenous gas in a lot of countries, or you produce a lot more gas that's available for export, and other countries are able to use gas rather than oil in an affordable way, we reduce oil prices at home because we have reduced and relieved and changed the slope of the demand curve for oil, because we're allowing other people to do something that's cleaner and more efficient and could be more cost effective if they have the resource, which is to burn gas rather than oil for electricity. In terms of a strategic tool, the ability to have agencies talk to other agencies. This program that I started survives my term in government. 5 years from now, 10 years from now, hopefully we're going to have these long-term scientific relationships. That's what makes diplomacy sustainable. And we can really support strategic diplomacy. Iran, containing Iran, reducing other countries' dependence on Iran, reducing the need for them to invest in Iran. It's a huge foreign policy issue. But finger wagging doesn't take you very far. So being able to go to countries that are importers and to be able to say to them that we can help you in a concrete way grow your own resources can change their relationships and their need to depend on countries like Iran. You think of Southern Sudan. Do they have potential? How much? Can they survive? Can they develop more oil? Do they have to be dependent on the North? Having that resource assessment, is really critical. And so for us, I would encourage you, especially as you're looking at tight budgets, not to think of doing these resource assessments with other countries as something that we do for them. This is not a gift to another country. This is a gift to us. We have the ability to have accurate information about the real resource potential of other countries by going to them, and they give us data that we would not get any other way, and then we get to publish it on the web. I mean, you really can't buy this information. To build that trust with other countries to do it is really indispensable for us. Give you just a sense of the range of countries that are excited about this. These are the 23 countries that came to our global shale gas initiative last summer. There are 7 countries on there that didn't make the list. If you take a look here, Eastern Europe, Africa, Latin America, China, India. If these are countries that, if you look at friends, allies, strategic countries, these are important to us. For us to be able to reach out to them to get their support on foreign policy initiatives is really valuable. I guess where I want to close is this: energy diplomacy, energy security really is going to depend hugely in a world where we're going to use oil and gas for the next couple of decades, and if not beyond, on our understanding of who else has the ability to produce. How will we get diversity of oil and gas supply? The most amount of resources from the greatest number of countries. Helping them get there helps us. Technical cooperation, peer-to-peer, is really the pathway to do this, because diplomats can only go so far. In an era of tight budgets, being able to use federal employees rather than contractors is not only faster, but much more sustainable and much more effective. And frankly, for the countries who are a little skeptical when we're coming in, much more persuasive in terms of who they trust. For at least as a former diplomat and senior official at the State Department, looking at this tremendous potential, our cooperation with the U.S. Geological Survey was one of the most successful partnerships that we had. It is going to survive me. My successor is as excited about the program as I am. But we really need USGS, even with getting some supplements from the department, to be able to deliver. We need the scientists. We need the ability to deliver that. The thing just about the Middle East piece, how important that is. The resource assessment that was done with Levant, the potential offshore Israel, offshore Lebanon, to transform the Middle East, is huge. Our ability to have that data, I mean, think of what a tool that is in terms of diplomacy and talking to those countries and changing their behavior. So we need to retain the capacity to do this for ourselves and to do it overseas, and to be able to have at least a small cadre of people that we can use as the scientific face of diplomacy. So I think it's really been indispensable work. It's important for our country, it's important for our national security, and those of you who have some influence on whether they'll be able to sustain this effort, I would encourage you to expand it as much as the budget will permit. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I'm going to ask the 3 speakers if they'll come up front now, and we'll have questions. I'd like to thank our host, Congressman Doc Hastings, again for allowing this briefing. So if they'll come up front, we'll have some questions. Questions? Yes.
Hi, Anna Cohen from the Natural Resources Committee. And it's for Brenda on your graph with the breakout of the unconventional gas. And, you know, obviously tight sands is still the largest, but it looks like shale is increasing most rapidly. So I have 2 questions. One, you know, in the U.S., where's the general location that the tight sands production is? And 2, do you have any predictions of when shale might overtake tight, and David might actually want to take a stab at that too? I don't know.
A lot of the tight gas is out west, so a lot is on federal land. So I think to some degree that's why we don't hear a lot about it, because BLM is managing it and taking it, and it has the public review process anyway. And that's a generalization, but for the most part, they're out west.
Okay.
I don't have a prediction for shale gas, because shale gas is, in my mind, more problematic geologically. They're very different, and we're still learning a lot about shale gas. Each one is very different. They're not the same. They decline very quickly. So I think it's a question. I mean, we have big numbers, but I think until we get in there and look at each and every basin and learn from the industry about what they're doing, We don't know. I mean, it has great potential, but what will that potential be realized? So I don't know. Do you want to take a stab at? I don't have a prediction of that.
I don't have a prediction either. I think the only thing I'd add is just this idea that of the geologic variability and the fact that these are not the same across basins and even within basins. We're looking at what are the sweet spots, because it's not the entire shale interval that is going to produce equally. It's really organic rich intervals that we're looking at.
Yes.
So that kind of raises a follow-up question. If the shale gas potential is so, it has potential, but the ability to realize that is so unpredictable, why are companies clamoring right now to go after it? I mean, if you're saying that, I mean, this takes a lot of resources, it takes a lot of water, it takes a lot of money to get at this stuff, right? And so if they don't know what the return's going to be long term, why do you think maybe this is the stage?
Well, I think you're putting your finger on the issue of how risky the exploration business is. And shale gas wells are expensive wells. I mean, we're talking $4 to $6 million per well. Each company has their own financial models that they use to try to project over the 20 to 30 years of a field or even beyond that in terms of how they're going to make that money back that they invest up front. So they see potential, they see long-term potential, and there are some policy drivers that could affect that.
I'm going to just add two things on the commercial side. One is that to the extent that you have liquids-rich plays, where you're finding liquids that are priced to oil rather than to gas, you're finding most of these companies are making their development costs back in 6 months. So it's a huge financial return. For those that were just looking at the Marcellus or initially looking for gas when gas prices were a little bit higher, you have the ability to access an enormous resource at what becomes, once you find those sweet spots, an increasingly affordable cost, and one where technology is enabling you to reduce the number of well sites, reduce the number of lateral wells, so you can get a huge amount of resource close to a high demand market, which is going to use gas for the long term. So I think you've seen this shift from the small players to the big players, because I think the big players are seeing that this resource is so huge that compared to importing or something else, it's worth the risk.
I figure the technology will, going in there and starting to explore will give them the opportunity to expand the technology and do it better as well.
And there's a phenomenal change in the number of wells, I think, reduced in the Marcellus, but production increased.
So you raised a good point. A lot of them went in when gas prices were a little higher. I mean, this profit is pretty marginal right now.
Well, also the nature of the oil and gas business is such, they do a lot of learning by doing. Frequently they have failures, but as long as there's a proportion of successes, then yes.
Well, you then lead it into the issue of the oil shale production in the U.S., or the oily shale, or whatever the term that we're seeing in the Bakken now. IEA came out, I guess, last week with some estimates about real growth in U.S. production of up to an extra 2 million barrels a day. How does that change? Because we have an administration that's trying to move away from oil. How does that conflict with our desires, our conflicting motivations in terms of climate policy and domestic oil policy? It seems that there's not a proper trade-off between one and the other when you're finding liquids that go into the petroleum dynamic, when gas is what many people really want.
You can confirm your comment on yes, but on the political side, it's not even our choice. And I think his March 30th, blueprint speech, the president made clear we're going to need oil and gas for a long time. We're going to need domestic production. We're going to need international production. We need to invest in reducing demand, and that's been pretty successful. But we need all of those. And so I think that's part of what you're seeing on the oil side. The issues have not really come up so much, but I think it was a clear signal that technology is enabling us to do things we thought were unimaginable. So it was support for shale gas.
But doesn't technology always ultimately allow us to do things that were previously unimaginable?
It's the time scale that's usually.
It's the intermediate period, and how long is the intermediate period that we talk about the continued oil age and the continued fossil fuel age? Because if it's longer than 5 or 10 years, then really what we may be seeing is a misallocation of some resources that we really are simply going to have cheap fossil fuels for quite a while.
Well, cheap fossil fuels would be nice, but there's no question we're going to have demand for decades. Even if U.S. oil demand and gasoline demand has peaked and demand is flat, we're still going to be importing a huge amount of oil. The price is still set globally. Demand in the rest of the world determines whether it's affordable or not. So, it's not. We will not be self-sufficient in oil, but technology may take us out of that pathway. But it still makes sense to contribute to domestic production by doing production of the Bakken. It still makes sense on a worldwide scale to have everybody reduce the intensity of oil so that we don't have to deal with politics. But it's the time scale is decades, not years.
Look, and I agree with all of that. I think one of the other things that we often hear in the policy debate, and this is where I wanted to try to talk about the difference between resources and reserves, is the idea that oftentimes we hear about a resource assessment and somebody will, it's X amount of barrels of oil, and somebody says, well, that's only 1 month's worth of U.S. consumption. Well, almost every field in the nation is only 1 month or less of U.S. consumption. So our entire supply curve is made up of these small incremental wedges, and I think that's important.
Hi, my name is Kasia Kwesińska. I'm from Bloomberg. I have a question for Brenda. You mentioned this global shale resources survey. When do you think it will be out, and which countries do you think it will focus on?
Well, it is a global, so we're doing them all. We've worked with State Department to prioritize countries that are certainly of interest to multiple people, not just us. So we're working in China, India, Jordan, South America now. We are not going to wait for the whole world to be done to release them. We will release assessments as we finish them. So we hope to have some done within the next, say, 6 months. We're also working in Eastern Europe. They are clamoring to work with us. So we're working with the Poles. We're starting a program in Ukraine. So it's kind of everywhere. So I don't know exactly when the first one will come out, but in the next few months. And so we'll over the next few years, be releasing these as we go.
I was wondering, it seems that part of the economic feasibility of developing unconventionals is the availability of water source. Are you at USGS or is anyone doing any assessments of programs of water availability in some of these formations?
Well, the USGS does have a program where we look at aquifers and water availability, but what we're doing in the Energy Resources Program is actually, especially for the unconventionals, trying to come up with a methodology to actually look at water budget needs so that we don't necessarily predict it on a one-to-one, but when we come out with our resource assessment and it says there's X TCF of gas, then if we have this methodology to say what the water budget is needed, depending upon the type of unconventional resource, then one can look at the water needed. So we're actually in the development of that now.
Do you have a time for that?
It just started, well, hopefully within the year. So again, because it's a new methodology, we want it to be quantitative. Once we develop it, we need to get it externally peer-reviewed, and then, so yes, hopefully within the year. Because clearly it's a big issue, and we need something that's not just qualitative or anecdotal, I think. So we are developing that, so hopefully soon.
And I think you also have the Secretary of Energy's subcommittee that's looking at hydraulic fracturing. Best practices is looking at water, everything from baseline measurements of water, cutting-edge practices on recycling of water, because it's an issue certainly here in the U.S. and it's an issue overseas. So it's a question of where is the technology on reducing on and water recycling as to what you use, as well as business.
And EPA has that study going on that we're working on as well.
And Interior has one otherwise.
Other questions? Okay, if not, thank you all for coming, and we hope you'll attend the next USGS.